She was kidnapped and forced into a deadly game where every move was watched, every choice a life or death decision. But what happens when the stakes get higher than she ever imagined? In this shocking true crime story, her tale is so unbelievable. Even the police didn't believe her. Stick around, because the final twist will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. You won't want to miss how this terrifying journey ends. For Minnie, she was walking down the quiet street, just like any other night. The air was cold, biting at her skin, her breath visible in the dim streetlights. Her footsteps echoed, hollow, in the silence. Suddenly, a shadow moved behind her. It was fast, too fast. Before she could turn, a hand clamped over her mouth. Her heart raced. Panic surged. She struggled, but his grip was too strong. His breath, hot and foul, against her ear. She tried to scream, but it was muffled. The world spun as he dragged her away. Darkness swallowed her. She was no longer on the street. Now, in some unfamiliar place. Cold walls. Rough hands tied her to a chair. Her heart beat loud in her chest. The room smelled of mildew and old wood. There were no windows. The door creaked open. She saw a figure standing in the doorway. A man. His face was hidden in shadows. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. Her mind screamed, but her body was frozen. She didn't know where she was, who these people were. Her thoughts were a blur. The man stepped closer. The air felt thick. Tension wrapped around her chest. She felt dizzy, her vision hazy. A sense of doom clawed at her. Suddenly, he spoke again. "You're not the first," he said, his voice cold. Her body stiffened. Not the first? What did he mean? Then there was the sound of another door opening. She heard a woman's voice, soft and fearful. Was she in the same situation? What were they going to do to them? The man walked toward the other door, leaving her alone. The silence in the room was suffocating. Time felt like it stopped. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. She didn't know how long she'd been there, but she could still hear the woman. Her voice cracked with fear. Then, the silence was shattered. A loud bang. Then another. The door burst open. She blinked in disbelief. The police rushed in. But they didn't believe her. They said she was delusional. The story was too crazy to be real. But the woman's voice echoed in her mind. She knew the truth. This was just the beginning. The police didn't believe her. They dismissed her, saying it was a panic attack. A figment of her imagination. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she make them understand? She sat in that cold interrogation room, trembling. Her hands shook uncontrollably. The officer across from her stared with a blank expression. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his tone skeptical. She nodded, desperate. "I swear, I'm telling you the truth," she said, her voice cracking. But he didn't seem convinced. He shifted uncomfortably, scribbling something on his notepad. He wasn't listening. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos. The woman's screams still haunted her. The air in that room had felt suffocating. The man's voice, cold and threatening. Her fear, so real. So tangible. But here she was, sitting in a sterile room with the walls closing in. It was as if the world was telling her she was insane. She had never felt so alone. Then, the officer stood up abruptly. He motioned for the door. "I'm going to have to recommend you see a therapist," he said coldly. And with that, he left the room. She was left in stunned silence. She stared at the door, her heart sinking. Was she crazy? Did she dream it all? But the memories were so vivid. The smell of mildew. The sound of her heartbeat in the dark. The feel of rough hands tightening around her wrists. Her breath still caught in her throat. She knew what she had experienced was real. Yet no one would believe her. She was trapped in a nightmare. Her stomach twisted in knots. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there. Watching. Waiting. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't done with her yet. Days passed, but the unease never left her. The world felt different now. Every shadow seemed darker. Every sound felt amplified. She couldn't escape the memories. The haunting images of the room, the man, the woman. Her body was still on high alert, as if something terrible could happen at any moment. She kept looking over her shoulder, but there was nothing. Nothing but the ever-present feeling of being watched. The fear gnawed at her every day. She tried to go on with her life, but it felt impossible. She couldn't shake the sensation that she was being hunted. It was a feeling that crept up on her in the middle of the night. A feeling that gripped her in broad daylight. Her phone rang one evening. The caller ID was unknown. Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello," she said, her voice shaky. There was silence on the other end. Then, a voice she didn't recognize whispered, "Don't trust them." Her blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The line went dead. She stared at the phone in shock. Who was that? Was it someone who knew what had happened to her? Her mind raced, spinning with possibilities. The room felt smaller. She needed answers. She needed to know who was behind this. Her instincts told her something far darker was at play. And as much as the police dismissed her, as much as they refused to believe her story, something was lurking beneath the surface. It was clear now. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of something much larger. The pieces began to fall into place in her mind, but they didn't make sense. Not yet. She had to find out the truth. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized the real nightmare hadn't even begun. The man took a slow step toward her, his movements deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But her feet felt rooted to the ground, paralyzed by fear. His face was still obscured by shadows, but she could see his eyes now. Cold. Calculating. Empty. She took a step back, then another. "Why are you following me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He just kept walking toward her, each step heavier than the last. Her heart pounded faster with every inch he closed. A shiver ran down her spine. "Stay back," she warned, her voice trembling. The words felt weak, useless. The fear in her chest threatened to choke her. But she couldn't back down now. Not after everything. She had to know the truth. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes still locked on hers. For a moment, the world seemed to go silent. Everything around them faded. The streetlights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. Then, without a word, the man reached into his jacket. She flinched, ready for something terrible. But instead, he pulled out a small envelope. He held it out to her, still silent. She stared at it, unsure whether to take it. Her pulse raced as she reached out cautiously, her hand shaking. Her fingers brushed against the paper. As soon as she touched it, the man turned and walked away without a glance back. She stood there for a long moment, frozen. What was this? Why now? With a trembling hand, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of her from the night she was taken. But it wasn't just her. In the background, barely visible, were two figures standing by a dark car. One of them was a man, the other a woman. Her stomach churned. She knew them, or at least she thought she did. Her breath hitched. The woman in the photo was familiar. But where had she seen her before? The pieces of the puzzle clicked together. The photo was proof. Proof that she hadn't imagined what had happened to her. But it raised even more questions. And in that moment, she realized something far worse. They were still watching her, still waiting. And the game was far from over. Her hands trembled as she held the photograph. Her mind raced, but her thoughts were a tangled mess. The woman in the photo, who was she? Where had she seen her before? A memory flickered, distant and hazy. She dug into the recesses of her mind, trying to pull it forward. And then it hit her. The woman was the same one she had heard in the background that night, her voice, soft and desperate. The realization was sharp, like a knife in her chest. It was no coincidence. But why hadn't she remembered sooner? The shadows around her seemed to stretch, pressing in on her. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She had to get away from the alley. She had to leave before the man came back. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move, to walk quickly. She had to think. She had to figure out what to do next. The police had already dismissed her once. Would they believe her now? The thought made her stomach churn. The fear clawed at her again, crawling under her skin. She couldn't trust anyone, not anymore. But what about the photograph? What if it was the key? Her mind darted from one possibility to the next. If the woman in the photo was involved, there had to be a link, a connection she wasn't seeing. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, to think clearly. The woman's face was etched in her memory now, even though she didn't know her name. Could it be someone from her past? Someone she had forgotten? The thought made her head spin. She had to track her down. She had to get answers. But then the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, pulling her back to reality. She turned her head, heart racing. Was it him? The man from the alley? No. It wasn't him. But the figure coming toward her was unfamiliar, and that in itself was enough to set her nerves on edge. Her breath caught in her throat as she instinctively took a step back. The figure stopped just a few feet away. A woman. And she was holding something in her hand. Something small, wrapped in dark cloth. "Are you looking for answers?" the woman asked, her voice calm, but her eyes sharp. The question hung in the air between them. How did she know? Who was she? The woman stepped closer, her gaze never leaving hers. And in that moment, everything froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Because this woman was connected to it all. The woman's eyes held an unsettling calmness, as if she knew everything. Her hand still gripped the dark cloth, and her steps were measured, deliberate. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, but she couldn't. Her feet felt stuck to the ground. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound confident. The woman didn't answer immediately. She only took another step forward, her gaze never wavering. "You've been asking the right questions," she said finally, her voice low but full of weight. "You think you're the only one?" The words hit like a cold wave. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and suffocating. She tried to steady her breath, but the fear was overwhelming. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "I can't explain everything, not yet," the woman said, her tone almost sympathetic. "But you're part of something bigger than you know." Her pulse quickened. The words felt like a punch to the gut. "Bigger than you know." The phrase echoed in her mind, but she couldn't make sense of it. The woman glanced down at the cloth in her hands, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, or regret. "You have to listen carefully," she continued. "What you think happened to you, it's not the whole story. The people you've been trusting, they've been lying to you." Her stomach turned at the mention of lies. Her grip on the photograph tightened, as if the answer to everything might be in that one single image. The woman's eyes softened for a moment, then hardened again. "I know you're scared. You have every right to be," she said quietly, stepping closer still. "But if you want to survive this, if you want to know the truth, you need to come with me." Her mind screamed no. Her legs screamed run. But the curiosity, no. The need to know, overwhelmed her. What choice did she have now? The police wouldn't help. She couldn't trust anyone else. And yet, standing before her, was this woman. Someone who seemed to know everything. Someone who could possibly lead her to the answers she needed. "You'll be safe with me," the woman added, her tone now more urgent. Her hands shook, but she nodded. "I don't have a choice, do I?" she whispered. The woman's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "Not if you want the truth." Without another word, The woman turned and started walking down the dark street. She hesitated for a moment, then followed. The chilling feeling of being watched still lingered, but now there was something else, a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was her chance to finally understand what was happening to her. But even as she followed the woman into the night, she couldn't shake the thought. Was this really the beginning of the truth? Or was it just another trap? They walked in silence, the night closing in around them. Her footsteps echoed in the empty street, too loud in the stillness. The woman led the way, her pace steady, confident. It felt as though she had done this before. She knew where she was going. But where was that? The streets were unfamiliar, darker than she remembered. Shadows stretched long under the flickering streetlights, and the night air seemed colder, more oppressive. She glanced around, anxiety crawling up her spine. Was anyone else watching them? Her heart beat faster as the woman turned a corner without looking back. She hurried to catch up, her breath sharp in the air. "Where are we going?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman didn't look at her, but her answer came, without hesitation. "You'll see soon enough." That wasn't reassuring. She swallowed, trying to steady her nerves. The woman's pace quickened, and they passed several buildings that seemed too quiet, too abandoned. Nothing looked familiar. Every street felt more desolate than the last. Her mind raced with questions, but she knew better than to ask too much. Something told her this woman was not one for patience. They walked for what seemed like miles, though it was hard to tell. Finally, they stopped in front of a large, worn-down building. It was an old warehouse, the kind you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. The door was slightly ajar. The woman looked over her shoulder at her, and her eyes held a warning. "Once you step inside," she said, her voice low, "there's no turning back." She felt the weight of the words settle deep in her chest. Every instinct told her to turn around, to run, but she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. With a shaky breath, she nodded. The woman pushed open the door, and they stepped inside. The warehouse was cold, damp. The smell of rust and decay filled the air. It was dimly lit by a few weak overhead lights that flickered erratically. The space was vast, empty, save for crates and old machinery scattered around. There was no sound, no movement. But something was there. Something she could feel. "Sit," the woman said abruptly, pointing to a metal chair in the center of the room. Her stomach clenched. She moved toward the chair slowly, each step echoing in the empty space. As she sat, she felt the weight of the room pressing in on her. The woman closed the door behind her, and the sound of the latch clicking shut made her flinch. It was too quiet now. She tried to steady her breathing, but her heart was pounding in her chest. And then, the woman spoke again. "They've been watching you. From the beginning." The words hit her like a slap. "Who?" she whispered, barely able to breathe. The woman stepped closer, her eyes never leaving hers. "The people who took you, they're not just criminals. They're part of something much bigger. Something you've unknowingly been involved in." Her head spun. "What are you talking about?" she gasped, gripping the arms of the chair as though it could hold her together. The woman knelt in front of her, her face just inches from hers. "You were chosen," she said softly. Her blood ran cold. "Chosen? For what?" she barely managed to ask, her voice barely audible. The woman's lips curled into a cold, knowing smile. "For the game," she whispered. And in that moment, she realized something worse than fear. This was just the beginning. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "For the game." Her heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts spiraling. What did that even mean? She tried to process it, but it felt like the ground beneath her was slipping away. The woman's smile never wavered, but her eyes were hard, calculating. "You don't understand yet," the woman continued, her voice steady but full of dark promise. "But you will. Soon." The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on her. She clenched her fists in her lap, trying to keep her breathing steady. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The woman leaned closer, her eyes darkening. "You were always meant to be part of this," she said, almost gently. "You just didn't know it. But now, you've crossed the line. You can't go back." Her stomach twisted with dread. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" She could barely contain the panic rising in her chest. The woman stood up, taking a step back, her posture relaxed, almost casual. "It's not about what we want from you," she replied, her tone shifting. "It's about what you have to offer, what you're capable of." She stared at the woman, confused and terrified. "What do you mean?" I'm not anything special." The woman laughed, a soft, cold sound that echoed off the walls. "You don't even realize it, do you?" she said. "You've always been special. Always." Her head spun as the words sank in. There was something in her past, something buried deep, that she couldn't quite remember. Something the woman seemed to know. The woman turned away, walking toward a small desk in the corner of the room. She rummaged through some papers before pulling out a small, leather-bound notebook. She walked back toward her, holding it out in front of her. "Look," she said, her voice low. "This is for you. It's time you knew the truth." Her hands were shaking as she reached for the notebook. The moment her fingers touched it, she felt a jolt of energy, like an electric current running through her. The woman watched her closely, her expression unreadable. She opened the notebook slowly, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was messy, hurried, but it was clear enough. And then she saw it. Her name. Her name was written on the page, but there was more. Beneath it was a series of cryptic symbols, lines, and words that made no sense. Her breath caught in her throat. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman's eyes darkened. "That's the start of it. The key to everything. The game has already begun." Her mind raced. Her name was in there, but it wasn't just that. It was something more. Something tied to the symbols, the strange words she couldn't understand. The woman didn't wait for her to process it. She turned and walked toward the back of the warehouse, her footsteps echoing in the silence. "I'll be back," the woman said over her shoulder. "You'll have time to think." But not much. She stood there, frozen, staring at the notebook in her hands. The fear, the confusion, the need to understand, it all collided. What had she gotten herself into? Was this really happening? The warehouse was silent again, but now it felt different. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. And in that silence, a thought whispered in her mind, a thought too chilling to ignore. She was never meant to be a victim. She was part of the game. And there was no escape. The weight of her realization pressed down on her like a physical force. She was part of the game. Her fingers gripped the leather-bound notebook tighter, her knuckles white. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't turn back now. The woman had been right. She had crossed a line. But what was the game? And why had they chosen her? Her heart raced as she stared down at the cryptic symbols and words on the pages. None of it made sense, not yet. She scanned the pages again, hoping for some clue, some hint that would explain it all. But it was no use. The symbols swam in front of her eyes, taunting her. What do they mean? The fear, the confusion, the need to understand, it all collided. What had she gotten herself into? Was this really happening? The warehouse was silent again, but now it felt different. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. And in that silence, a thought whispered in her mind, a thought too chilling to ignore. She was never meant to be a victim. She was part of the game. And there was no escape. The weight of her realization pressed down on her like a physical force. She was part of the game. Her fingers gripped the leather-bound notebook tighter, her knuckles white. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't turn back now. The woman had been right. She had crossed a line. But what was the game? And why had they chosen her? Her heart raced as she stared down at the cryptic symbols and words on the pages. None of it made sense, not yet. She scanned the pages again, hoping for some clue, some hint that would explain it all. But it was no use. The symbols swam in front of her eyes, taunting her. What do they mean? She closed the notebook with trembling hands, the weight of its contents still heavy in her lap. The silence in the warehouse was unbearable now. Her thoughts raced. Where had the woman gone? She glanced around the dimly lit room, but it was empty. The stillness was oppressive. She needed answers. She couldn't just sit here and wait. She stood up, pacing back and forth, the echo of her footsteps filling the vast, empty space. The feeling of being watched returned, crawling under her skin, making her skin prickle. Was it the woman? Or was it someone else? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp sound, the creak of a door opening in the distance. She froze, her body tense. Someone was here. The woman emerged from the shadows, holding something in her hands. A small device, black and sleek. She approached with calm steps, her expression unreadable. She stopped a few feet away, holding the device out to her. "It's time," she said, her voice low. Her stomach twisted again. "Time for what?" "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaky, but she knew she had to ask. The woman didn't answer immediately. She simply placed the device into her hands, her grip firm, her eyes never leaving her face. "Turn it on," the woman instructed. Confusion swirled in her mind. She didn't want to, but the woman's presence was overwhelming. There was no choice. Slowly, she pressed the button on the device. The screen flickered to life, and a cold, metallic voice filled the room. "Initiating Phase 1. Welcome to the game." Her blood ran cold. The words echoed in her mind, sending a shiver down her spine. The game had started. There was no turning back now. The woman stepped back, watching her intently as the screen blinked with more cryptic information. Her hand clenched around the device, but her body was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of what was happening. The voice continued. "Your first task is simple. Trust no one." Her heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a warning, but they also felt like an instruction. Her thoughts scattered in every direction. What was going on? The room seemed to close in on her, the shadows deeper now. She felt trapped. The woman gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's begun," she said quietly, her voice as cold as ice. Her breath caught in her throat as the implications of that simple sentence settled in. The game was real, and she was in it. But she had no idea what the rules were. And the worst part? She had no idea who she could trust. The voice on the device continued to speak, its cold, mechanical tone echoing in the quiet warehouse. "Phase 1. You will be watched. You will be tested. You will have no allies." Her pulse quickened. The words were meant to instill fear, and they were succeeding. But what was this game? What kind of test was she about to face? The woman in front of her didn't speak. She merely observed, her eyes dark and unwavering. Every instinct screamed at her to demand answers, to ask what was happening, what this all meant. But the device in her hand felt like a ticking clock. Each second that passed was another moment in which she could lose control. The woman finally broke the silence, her voice soft yet stern. "Trust no one," she repeated. "It's the first rule. The most important." Her mind raced, trying to process everything. The woman's words, the cryptic message, the device in her hands. What was she supposed to do with all of this? Was this just some sick game for amusement? The woman stepped closer, her eyes searching her face, as though reading her thoughts. "Look around," the woman said, her voice low and almost soothing. "Do you feel the eyes on you?" She froze. The feeling, that unsettling sensation of being watched, had never left her. It was in every shadow, every corner. Her gaze shifted quickly, scanning the dimly lit warehouse. There was nothing visible. No cameras, no people. But somehow, she knew they were there, watching her. "Who's watching?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman's lips curled into a small, almost sympathetic smile. "That's the game, isn't it?" she replied. "You'll never know who's watching. You'll never know who's part of it, and who isn't." Her stomach churned with dread. This wasn't just some random act. There was a system, a network, and she was right in the middle of it. "You need to be careful," the woman added, her voice carrying a hint of urgency. "Every move you make will be watched. Every decision you make will shape the rest of this." Her grip on the device tightened. The message flashed again on the screen. Phase 1 complete. Begin Phase 2 within 24 hours. Her head spun as she tried to make sense of the cryptic message. 24 hours? What would happen in that time? And what would happen if she failed the test? She looked at the woman, desperate for more answers, but the woman's expression was unreadable. "Where do I go from here?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step back. "There's nothing more I can do for you," she said quietly. "You're on your own now. But remember, trust no one." The finality in her voice sent a chill down her spine. She felt a rush of panic, but it was quickly replaced by a cold determination. She had to figure this out. She couldn't trust anyone, not even the woman in front of her, who seemed to know everything. But where did that leave her? Alone, in a game she didn't understand, surrounded by people she couldn't trust. And the worst part? She had no idea what Phase 2 would bring. The woman turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the silence of the warehouse. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The device still pulsed in her hands, a cold reminder of the game she had been forced into. She looked down at the screen once more, but the message hadn't changed. Phase 1 complete. Begin Phase 2 within 24 hours. Her thoughts tangled. What could Phase 2 mean? What was she supposed to do? She glanced around the dark room, her senses heightened. The silence was deafening now, oppressive. She had no allies, no one to help her, and she was running out of time. Her gaze fell on the small, dimly lit door at the far end of the warehouse. It was slightly ajar. Without thinking, she moved toward it. The cold air hit her face as she stepped through the door, and she realized she was outside. The city stretched out before her, quiet, dark, unfamiliar. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know who to trust. But the one thing she did know was that she couldn't stay here. Her fingers trembled around the device, her mind reeling. She had to act. She had to make a move. 24 hours. The clock was ticking, and she had no idea what was coming next. Her eyes scanned the street, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that someone was watching her. The streets were empty, the night still. But that didn't mean she was alone. She had to find out what was really going on. She turned and walked briskly down the street, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The weight of the device in her hand felt heavier with every step. She needed answers. She couldn't just blindly follow the rules they set for her. But where would she even begin? Her mind kept circling back to the message on the screen. Trust no one. What did that really mean? It was so simple, yet so terrifying. She thought back to the woman, the one who had brought her here. Could she trust her? Had she been part of this game all along? The uncertainty clawed at her. The world around her seemed to shift, as if it were all part of the game. Every building, every face she passed, felt like part of a larger puzzle she couldn't yet see. Her stomach twisted with fear, but she kept moving forward, determined to find the answers she needed. A few blocks down, she saw a shadow dart across the street. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. She reached into her pocket, gripping the small device, her mind racing. Was it them? Had they found her already? She ducked into an alley, pressing herself against the cold brick wall, trying to control her breathing. She couldn't see who it was, but the footsteps were unmistakable. Someone was close. She held her breath, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped just a few feet away. Her heart raced. Whoever it was had to know she was there. Was this a test? Or was this someone who actually meant her harm? The tension hung in the air like a weight. Then, without warning, a figure appeared at the end of the alley.
A man.
Tall, with a dark jacket pulled tight around his frame. He didn't see her at first. She stayed completely still, her heart pounding in her chest. And then he turned. Their eyes met. His expression was unreadable, but something about the way he looked at her made her freeze. He stepped closer, slowly, deliberately. She backed away, her breath shallow. "Do you know what's going on?" she asked before she could stop herself. The words felt reckless, but they were out now. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Then he spoke, his voice low and calm. "It's only just beginning." The words felt like a punch to the gut. And then, before she could respond, he turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving her standing alone in the alley, more confused and terrified than ever. The game was far from over. She stood there, her body frozen, her mind scrambling to make sense of the last few moments. The man had disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of his words behind. "It's only just beginning." The message was simple, yet it struck her with the force of a freight train. The game, whatever it was, had only just started, and she was still in the middle of it. Her fingers tightened around the device in her hand as she fought to steady her breathing. The weight of the night, the fear, the uncertainty, all pressed in on her like a vice. What now? Where did she go from here? She couldn't let herself falter. Not now. She couldn't afford to be weak. Every step, every breath, felt like part of a larger plan she couldn't yet understand. But the more she thought about it, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a random set of events. It was a calculated game. A game where she was just another piece in a much larger puzzle. Her phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence of the night. She jumped, startled, her heart racing. She pulled it from her pocket, expecting a message from the woman, from the game organizers, but it was something else entirely. A single message from an unknown number. "You're being watched. Make the right choice." The words were short, direct, and chilling. She looked around frantically, half expecting to see eyes staring at her from the shadows. Make the right choice. She had no idea what that meant, but it felt like a warning. A reminder that every decision now mattered. She couldn't trust anyone. That much was clear. Not the woman, not the man, and certainly not the game itself. Her body was shaking now, the realization hitting her harder than she expected. She had no choice but to keep moving, to keep playing, because the alternative, standing still, hiding in fear, wasn't an option. The timer on the device blinked again. Phase 2 will begin in 12 hours. The countdown had started. She didn't know what Phase 2 would bring, but she couldn't waste time questioning it. It was time to prepare. Whatever this game was, whatever the stakes were, she was going to see it through. There was no going back. The cold night air bit at her skin as she walked, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. The city seemed to stretch endlessly before her, a maze of streets and shadows. But this time, she felt a strange sense of clarity, a realization that she had come to terms with something deeper than the fear that had gripped her. She was no longer just a player in the game. Somewhere along the way, it had become clear. The game was bigger than any of them. It wasn't just about the rules they set. It wasn't about the cryptic messages or the tests they threw at her. It was about something more, something she still didn't fully understand but could feel deep in her bones. Her fingers brushed the device again. The countdown was gone now, replaced with a message that read, Phase 3, Endgame. Her heart skipped a beat. Endgame. This was it. The final phase. The woman, The man, everyone who had crossed her path, they were all pieces in something larger, something she could never control. But what she could control, what she had finally realized, was her reaction to it. She had made it this far by refusing to bend, by refusing to let fear consume her. And now, standing at the precipice of the game's final phase, she was ready to face whatever came next. She stopped walking, her eyes scanning the quiet street before her. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of the warehouse where it all began. It felt like a lifetime ago. But she wasn't the same person anymore. The person who had walked into that place, terrified and lost, no longer existed. She was stronger now. And whatever the endgame was, she would face it head-on. The city was quiet, as though holding its breath. The weight of everything hung in the air. She took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the unknown. The game was over, but for her, the real journey was just beginning.